In this video, we are going to take a look at how to create plugins in Cadwork 3D with the Python language. The Python programming language interface for Cadwork 3D is available on version 27 and up. The plugin we're going to build is called DualExport. It exports the shop drawing of a container and a piece-by-piece shop drawing of the elements inside the container. It also allows selecting multiple containers and exporting everything at once. We select both containers in this file. Then we use the API toolbar to select the DualExport button. The 3D will process the necessary data. Once the export is complete, there's a message giving us the number of clipboards that are available. In the 2D program, we can paste the clipboards all at once using a range instead of a single clipboard number. To create a Python plugin, we simply need to create a folder inside the API x64 folder located inside the 3D folder of the user profile. Inside this folder, we create a Python file with the same name as the folder. The Python file can be edited using any text editor. A nice feature is that the 3D doesn't have to close and reopen to make changes to the code. We can simply change the code in the Python file, save, and rerun the plugin. The documentation for the Cadwork 3D API is available at the address at the bottom of the screen. This site contains the latest version of the documentation and is evolving with the software. The GitHub project page for the Cadwork 3D API is available at the address at the bottom of the screen. The GitHub project page for the plugin we are building is available at the address at the bottom of the screen. This page contains the code used in this video. Here we have the Python code of the plugin opened in a text editor. Let's go through section by section. The very first line contains the import statements for the various controllers we're going to use later. The next line calls the getActiveIdentifiableElementIDs function of the element controller and puts the result in a variable called activeElement. This variable contains a list of the element IDs of whatever was active at the time. Here we see the relevant section of the documentation for the element controller. We see the function and its return type and input arguments if applicable. There are no input arguments in this case. We only receive an element list. In this section, we filter the list of active elements to only keep containers. To do this, we create an empty list called active containers. We then loop over all the items in the active elements list with a regular Python for loop. We check if the element is a container by using the isContainer function of the attribute controller. This function returns a Boolean, and if the element is a container, we append it to the active containers list. Here we see the isContainer section of the attribute controller documentation. We see that the function takes an element ID as an input argument and returns a Boolean. The next section is mainly set up for the export. We initialize a clipboard number to 0. We also use two functions of the utility controller to temporarily disable the check and query prompts. We do this to minimize the user interaction at runtime. The first function pushes the current check and query settings on the stack so that we can retrieve it later on. This is important since we don't want to permanently change the check and query settings of the user. We then call a function to set all queries to no queries. Here we can see the relevant section in the utility controller documentation relating to check and query. In this section, we loop over all the containers inside the active containers list. This is again done using a Python for loop. There is one special line in this section, line 31, which creates a list with a single element. This is needed since some functions, like the export container with clipboard we are using 2 lines down, requires a list of elements and not a single element. We then increment the clipboard number by 1, and finally we export the shop drawings for the container to the clipboard. This function requires a clipboard number and the list of containers to be exported. Here we see the relevant section of the shop drawing controller documentation. The next line simply gets the content of the container to be able to export a piece-by-piece shop drawing. The getContainerContentElements takes the container itself and returns a list of elements that are assigned to the container. Here we see the documentation of the function, which takes an element and returns an element list. In the next section, we increment the clipboard by 1 again. We then call the export piece-by-piece with clipboard function of the shop drawing controller with the clipboard number and the elements to be exported. In this case, the content of the container we're currently processing. We can see the documentation of the function used here. In the final section, we pop the check and query settings from the stack to recover the settings that were active before we disabled the queries on line 26. We then check the number of clipboards to verify if we had any abnormalities. If we have at least one clipboard, we display a message to the user displaying the number of clipboards available. Otherwise, we display an error. In both cases, we are using the print error function of the utility controller. The print error function can be used for more than printing errors. There are two functions that display messages to the user: print message and print error. The only difference is that with print error, the user needs to acknowledge the message. In our case, we want the user to acknowledge the message since the number of exported clipboards is essential to be able to paste the correct values in 2D. Here we see the documentation for the check and query functions of the utility controller. And here we see the documentation of the print error function. This is our final Python code. The file is saved, and we can now test our plugin in 3D. Let's look at the results once again. We select both containers in this file. Then we can use the API toolbar to select the DualExport button. The 3D will process the necessary data. Once the export is complete, there's a message giving us the number of clipboards that are available. In the 2D program, we can paste the clipboards all at once using a range instead of a single clipboard number.